Bryan Stevenson is a public interest attorney and the founder and director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He's also the author of a lot of books, including Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. He joins us live now from Montgomery, Alabama. Bryan, I understand that Jesse Jackson was a friend of yours, and I just have to start by saying I'm so deeply sorry for your loss. One of the things that touched me about Jesse Jackson's life and legacy were his words that his constituency were the desperate, the damned, the disinherited, the disrespected, and the despised. And if you look at Jesse Jackson's words and his actions, there was this relentless focus on ensuring economic empowerment for minorities, obviously, especially Black people. And just thinking about your work when it comes to equal justice, obviously the work of Jesse Jackson dovetails almost perfectly with what you have been focused on doing with your life as well. You know, I imagine for you, you couldn't really ask for a better mentor for you than someone like Jesse Jackson. What kind of a friend was he to you, Bryan?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. He was an extraordinary friend and a source of deep encouragement and inspiration for the work that we do. I think he took Dr. King's concerns about the poor to heart. When Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis in 1968, he was planning a poor people's campaign. And Reverend Jackson, I think more than anyone else, took to heart that commitment, that vision, in creating PUSH, and for 5 decades continued to lift up the voices of the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised. He was always a champion for anyone who needed a champion. And he was a great source of inspiration to me. He came to Montgomery every year. We would spend time together. He came to everything we opened. When we opened the legacy sites, he was right there and became, really committed to that. He's what pushed me and others to start thinking about anti-poverty work in addition to the legal work that we do. And we're now doing that work. And it's a great loss. He did have a singular and unique voice in American politics, but also just in American life. His speech at the 1988 Democratic Convention, I think, was one of the great orations. He was charismatic, but he was committed to those who needed someone to champion their cause. And I think that legacy is so unique in this country.
Yeah, and that's, we just actually heard from Al Sharpton, and that's one of the things that he was talking about as well. I mean, this idea that who Jesse Jackson was in public and who he was in private and what he cared about and what he was obsessed with were a perfect match, essentially. But I do have to ask, Jesse Jackson, obviously, like none of us, he was not perfect. He was certainly a complicated figure and he had his share of missteps. And I think that when you're dealing with any kind of cultural or moral icon, the fact that they are complicated is what gives them depth. It's what allows people to relate to you. It gives you a sense of authenticity. Sometimes with politicians, when they are too perfect, it doesn't allow for that kind of ability to relate. And also you end up becoming far too manufactured. Jesse Jackson wasn't going to compromise who he was for anybody. So my question to you, though, is what do you think was most misunderstood about Jesse Jackson, especially as it pertains to the areas in which he did make a few missteps?
Well, I think that he genuinely wanted to be the kind of person God intended him to be. He would say, I'm not perfect. God's not finished with me yet. And he was constantly striving to meet all of the expectations that he had for himself, to be a moral, committed, compassionate human being. I think, though, that people underestimate his commitment to anyone and everyone who was in difficulty, anyone and everyone who was being oppressed or mistreated or abused. You didn't have to be Black. You didn't have to be an American. You could be othered, you could be disfavored. And if you were, then Jesse Jackson was somebody who wanted to champion your cause. And I just think that kind of openness to helping all of God's children, to helping anyone and everyone who's in distress, I think that's what made him so unique. And I think the other thing about him is I appreciate what Reverend Sharpton is saying as well. He was incredibly kind. He was compassionate. In his last few years, he lost his mobility. He lost his ability to be as, consistently articulate in all things that had defined his career. But he found ways to communicate things that were so important. He was here last year during a dedication we were doing, and He was in a wheelchair. He couldn't say very much, but as I was speaking, as we were doing things, he would occasionally just put his hands up and make the shape of a heart. And it was just his way of saying,
so sweet.
this is good. And it was so moving. And that was who he is. His heart was a heart really rooted in compassion toward others, I think, more than and many people I can think of in public life, or anyone really. He took to heart that biblical injunction to do justice and to love mercy. And I think that can't be overstated in terms of what his core was about, what his heart and his commitment was connected to.
I mean, I love that. I love that story because, again, it's the fact that the sort of private side to him, you know, when he's not on the pulpit, when he's not on the podium, seemed to match what we saw of Jesse Jackson in public as well. I think that one of the other things that, you know, just in terms of Jesse Jackson's legacy, and it's a more subtle aspect to his legacy, is the fact that he really popularized the term African American. I mean, obviously people use the term African American prior to Jesse Jackson, but he really made it his mission to sort of get it to be used widely instead of black. And his argument was that, you know, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, they have a natural sort of connection to their homelands. African Americans, given the history of slavery and racial injustice and being obviously having ancestral ties to Africa, should be given the same. And, you know, that is important because language is such an important part of our identity, and it shapes not just who we are, but our opinion of ourselves as well. And so, you know, just talk to us about the sort of more subtle ways that perhaps Jesse Jackson shaped culture and identity in ways that are not necessarily appreciated, do you think?
Yeah, I think he very much wanted to change how African Americans saw themselves and how they were seen by other people. I mean, he was born in rigid Jim Crow segregation in South Carolina. He endured all of the humiliation and the degradation of racial exclusion that shaped the lives of so many people. We talked a lot about a lynching that took place in Greenville, South Carolina, when he was just a little boy, and the profound impact it had on his thinking about the status of Black people. Why was it that mob violence and lawlessness was allowed to terrorize millions of African Americans in this country? And that's what pushed him into civil rights activism. It's what put him on the front lines of challenging segregation, spending time with Dr. King and all of the extraordinary people who were the architects of that movement, gave him insights about what was going to be needed. He lived through a lot of the urban conflict and distress, and he saw young people struggling to create an identity. And so things like African American, taking pride, his speeches where he would talk about "you are somebody," was an effort to help people see themselves as fully deserving of justice, fully entitled to respect, fully empowered to vote and participate. And language is important. And I think Reverend Jackson understood the power of language. He understood the power of inclusion, pushing companies and corporations that were not being fair to their workers to see the full value of their workers as something that has to be articulated. All of that, I think, was his, important insight into what human beings need. We have an identity, we have a status, but sometimes we need to name it, we need to articulate it to appreciate all the things that we are. And he wanted Black people in this country to know all the things that we are not some lesser ethnic group, some distinct ethnic group with no origins, no history. And terms like African American were really important of establishing that identity and creating a source of pride, which he was really powerful at giving to other people.
Yeah, it's powerful. You know, it's powerful. He has changed this country in ways that are deeply subtle, deeply visible, and deeply profound. Bryan Stevenson, I am so sorry for your loss. As I mentioned to you during the commercial break, I am so sorry for all of our loss now that Reverend Jackson has crossed over, but especially yours because you knew him personally. Bryan Stevenson, thank you so much. We'll be right back with more after this short break.